Mr. Robert Grant.
Thank you very much. Again, I think Ed got us going a little bit about the history and the presentations. The VLR, or Very Long Range Mission, was designated for the Iwo Jima to Japan and back Air Forces of the pilots that were there. The 506th fighter group came in a little bit after the 15th and 21st landed there, just as Sarabachi was being taken. And the 506 came in, and we'll talk about, I'll introduce our fighter pilots that are here today in a second. But just want to lay some groundwork for you. The last 6 months of the war, basically around April, May, of course, the European theater war ended. So now everybody's attention turned to the Pacific War. And what happened was that basically when the war ended in August, the 506 fighter group, who had been over the skies of Japan for quite some few months at that time, and were taking losses, tremendous, strenuous, long flights over open water. Very dangerous. These guys were trained to fly these long missions. Many of them were chosen to join the 506 because of their previous history of also flying long hours. Now, my dad, Captain J.J. Grant, and he didn't retain his captainship until he was on Iwo Jima itself, but he had joined just up after Pearl Harbor. He was a graduate of Syracuse University. He was married and had a little daughter called James. And James was this tiny little doll-looking baby, and they called her Dolly. And that's how we get the name Dolly on the plane that we're going to see. That's basically being unveiled today for the first time. She did fly in the air show, but today is her unveiling, and we're absolutely so honored that the Planes of Fame Air Museum has decided not only my dad, but the 506 to represent these fighter pilots here today. So I ask that the audience and everybody here join in with the spirit of the 506 fighter group, because they aren't here today. Those that were killed in action, and they were losing, what, at about 2 pilots every mission. At that time, and I'm just trying to set the pace here and to give you some color of what these guys went through. So what was happening is that the Japanese, near the end of the war, were starting to hoard their fighter aircraft for what they thought was the coming invasion. So they weren't putting up a lot of aircraft. So what are they going to do? Well, let's go strafing, as if they had nothing better to do after flying 3.5 hours, 4 hours to get to their target over open water in a single-engine fighter plane. And that's a long time. And you're just getting there. You got big fuel tanks on your wings to help them constantly trying to conserve fuel because they've got to get back to Iwo Jima. There's no place else to go. China's too far, there's no other base. So Iwo Jima becomes their home. Where, by the way, when the island was taken, over 6,500 Marines died to take Iwo Jima. And these guys came into Iwo Jima with Japanese still fighting on the island. And we'll tell stories about what happened on the island at times to the pilots. And we also have some video for you, some combat footage that has survived. And then I know you're anxious to hear from the pilots themselves, and I'll introduce our 2 pilots, fighter pilots. On my left here, first is Ed Linfante. Let's stand up. 462nd Fighter Group. Also, within the same group is Dolly, that we'll see a little bit later on. And to the left of him is Bill Eversole, fighter pilot. Thank you, Bill. And Bill actually flew the wing several missions on Dolly's wing also. So he has some great stories for us. Bill also earned the DFC for his efforts during the war. And it only took 10 missions to Iwo to Japan and back to get a DFC. 10. 12 missions, you went home. And by the end of the war, most people were just approaching 10, 11, 12. And so, you know, the war ended and they were going home anyway, most of them. Ed, you have to stay on, he'll probably tell you about that a little bit. We ended up in the Philippines after the war. Okay, so let's get on with the presentation. And what I'm going to start with is a VLR, a history, a little bit of a beginning history. Ed had talked us pretty well about Iwo Jima. There's a small, tiny little island, 5, 6, 7 miles across. Airfields were being built. The Japanese had built the airfields there, and they were harassing the B-29 bombers that were then coming up from Guam and Tinian, and that were going into Japan to do their attack. And talk about May to August of 1945. Now, very long-running commission, the 7th Fighter Command, which had become the 7th Fighter Command after the Hawaiian Air Force. So on Pearl Harbor Day, the Hawaiian Air Force, of course, took quite a beating, as well as the naval forces. And after that, they were formed into the 7th Fighter Command, and they were basically dispersed throughout the Southern Pacific in rather remote areas. So they weren't into fighting the war to begin with. Over the course of a few years, they started to move up, and they did get into the Americanas campaign, in which they started to experiment with fuel tanks on the wings and trying to get fighter escort to the bombers that were going out on these long-range missions. The B-29s at the time that were going to Japan and back from the Marshall Islands were going in without fighter escort. And we'll talk about that. But basically the pilots themselves, if they went to Tokyo, they became members of the Tokyo Club, and it was a simple task, of course. Well, we'll talk about that simple task, and we'll hear from our pilots about what it took to actually fly those great distances. We've introduced myself, and there's a picture of Dolly as she appears today, and you can see that the fighter squadrons, there was 3 of them. There was the 457 fighter squadron, 458 and 462nd, that comprised of the 506th fighter group itself. So 3 squadrons. Dolly was in the 46, along with Ed and Bill. And we'll tell stories about them as we go along, because their journey is the VLR journey. Here's a picture of Bill of Iwo Jima. And Bill was what we think was the youngest pilot at the time, just turning 20, I believe, Bill? 19? 21 after the war, but he was there, he was about 20 on Iwo Jima. And there was a look photographer on Iwo Jima at the time called Loomis Dean, who became quite famous afterwards and take pictures of Hollywood stars and things of this sort. But he worked for Look. He was on the island with a story about the youngest pilot and the oldest pilot on Iwo Jima. Well, it just turns out that Bill was the youngest, and my father, J.J. Grant, was the oldest. Dad was probably 27 years old or so when he was flying these missions, and Bill just turned 20. So there's the story. And we found a lot of these pictures in the National Archives, by the way. Bill, another shot of him. Meet after there, Bill. Real fast story. Get us started here. Bill's plane, they named Honest Mistake, as you can see here. And you notice there's some cartoon characters, a little hard to see, but it's basically a Japanese person here and stuff like that. And the story is that Jim Burkhoff, who shared the plane with Bill, who they just met again in our last reunion in Pennsylvania just a couple months ago after 6 or 7 years. Had never seen each other since then, so that was quite a reunion. And Jim told the story of how the plane got named. Basically, he went in on a strafing mission over Japan and got into an airfield and got into a building he thought was like a command post. And he peppered it pretty good and he flew back and he got a call and he said, you better come see your film, your combat film, Jim. And he said, okay, fine. And they looked, and here was Jim Burkall shooting up an outhouse, and a Japanese man running out of the outhouse with a toilet paper flying. So here's the outhouse, here's the Japanese soldier, and honest mistake was painted on the plane. They'll never knew that until last night. So they didn't share that story until just now. Just a little, but actually it's not really funny what these guys went through. It was very dangerous work. Here's a picture of at Linfante. You can see the gas tanks here. Were these the bigger tanks? Those 120-gallon tanks, and they have them on both sides of the wing. Plus they have fuel in the wing, and they had a 90-gallon tank in back of their seat.
On this side, the tank on the side here, which is strapped, did not carry fuel. They carried a life raft. And as we did our combat air patrol, if a pilot went down, naturally we would drop that tank and it would open up and the life raft was accessible to the pilot. I don't remember it ever happened in any combat patrol that I was on, but it may have happened once or twice.
Thank you. We'll find all sorts of interesting anecdotes here as we go along. So let's get into pre-506 so that we have a clear picture of what was to happen. There's Ed again in 616, and we'll have Ed talk a little bit during a second. So basically, just after Pearl Harbor, the 7th Fighter Command was created, and they were, as I said earlier, had been dispersed pretty much outside the war zone. But in the meantime, the War Department knew that eventually we were going to need fighter aircraft to protect our B-29s over Japan, because they knew the B-29s were going to take quite a beating from the Japanese Air Force, and which they did. So they started experimenting with the belly tanks that we just saw, and flew some missions escorting B-24 Liberators to Iwo Jima from Saipan. And so they started to get a feel for, first of all, thank you. And the range of the B-29 bombers were coming up from bases in Tinian and Guam, and so they were flying 18-hour, 20 missions out and back. So, but they had to go by Iwo Jima, or in the vicinity of Iwo Jima, to get to Japan. And so it became quite evident that Iwo Jima was going to need to be taken so that we could then have some P-51D model Mustangs that could make the distance, although just barely, to protect the B-29s that were taking quite a beating at this time from the Japanese Air Force. What happened in the beginning is that they started bombing at 35,000 feet, the B-29s, and they could get up so high that they could basically not worry about flak, and not many of the fighters could get up there, so they had kind of a clear path. But over Japan, and which we'll also talk about, and in that area of the Pacific, the weather is notorious for typhoons, huge cloud formations that just go from sea level all the way up to 45,000 feet. And so weather is a tremendous problem for not only B-29s, but as we'll talk about, some of the tragedies that happen on some of the missions just through the weather, just getting to Japan and back. But what they were finding out is that when the bombs were dropped at that altitude, there was such high winds that it would disperse the bombs dropping, so that they missed their targets most of the time. So what to do about that? Well, we got Curtis LeMay, who came in and took over Fighter Command at that time. And you can see that the B-29s were actually pressurized cabins, so that's how they could fly so high. They didn't have to wear oxygen masks or whatever. They could basically be very comfortable in the plane. Being in a B-29 can be comfortable, but a lot better than being in a P-51. So Curtis LeMay came aboard in the Marianas, and he said that the missing of the targets was unacceptable, that this was not going to happen, that we had to stop the war machine of the Japanese by bombing their military targets throughout the islands. And therefore, he had turned the tide of that to low altitude bombing and using incendiary bombs, which would cause fires. And of course, Japan had a lot of things built of paper and wood, as we know. So it would create just total havoc for them on the ground when these incendiaries would light. One occasion, they bombed Tokyo. I think there's, 30 square miles of the city was burned out. Anyway, more people died in that event that one night through the incinerator bombing than the Hiroshima bomb, which a lot of people don't know about. So it was very devastating, but it had to be done. But at that low altitude now, they're prey to the fighters, the Franks. Some of the nicknames of the fighters were Franks. Of course, we know about the Zero, the famous Zero. And they were sending up about 300 at a time and going in on the B-29s, and these guys were taking a panic. So there was several key things that needed to be worked out logistically. One, you needed to get fighter escort for the B-29s over Japan to take on the fighters and relieve the B-29s of all this attacking they were taking. The other thing was that they needed a base for which B-29s could land in an emergency situation, which was quite often. Low fuel, plane shot up, different things weren't working on the plane from flak and fighter attacks that they took. So they really had to get someplace to land also. So in comes, at this point, again, Iwo Jima becomes the key factor because it's on the way back from Japan in the flight path of the B-29s, getting back to the Marianas. So, flight takes off, and we've got our P-51s are ready to land on Iwo Jima. Problem is that they're still fighting on the island. They haven't fully taken over the island. They thought it was going to take them about 3 days. And it took them like 32 days, I think, before they called the island secure. In the meantime, we had taken over the airfields and started to build them to our specifications. Now, the island is volcanic, extinct volcano, and down at one end is the famous Suribachi volcano that is, many of you have seen pictures of. And then the rest is pretty much a flat surface, so there's plenty of room for some airfields on this 7 square mile island. At this point, for instance, they started to land, and most of them in the beginning of the 15th and 21st landed, and they had just gotten there as Suribachi was hit. So there was still a lot of fighting going on. Some of the flights, the early flights, were just a matter of loading up with some bombs, flying off Iwo Jima, come around the other side, bomb where the Japanese were, and then land. And they just did that until finally the island became secure, and they concentrated now on getting fighter escort to the B-29s. This map you see above me here is one of Ed Linfante's maps, and what they did is that they knew that there would be a lot of planes, P-51s, that were going to have emergency situations coming back from Japan. Again, like the B-29s, even having aircraft damage from ground fire, low on fuel, engine problems, all sorts of things. So we had quite an array of pilots bailing out, or the P-51 really wasn't known for ditching because of the air scoop underneath there. When it came in, it was not something you wanted to do. So the pilots are always told to parachute out. And one of the other things that is unbelievable is that they didn't sit in a seat, as you would see like Dolly is equipped with here, which probably would have made things a little bit more comfortable for them. Instead, they sat on a dinghy and a parachute. And then they flew missions up to 8.5, and sometimes, as reported by our own fighter, is 9 hours in this plane sitting on a parachute and a dinghy. and they'll talk about this in a second. I'm almost done. I know you want to figure these pilots out. But here's a map of showing the rescue points. They would have destroyers, submarines, PDYs, all sorts of rescue craft, all parked from Japan all the way down to Iwo to grab any pilots that went into the drink. Harsh conditions on Iwo also, a volcanic island, dust, heat, humidity, sulfur was underneath the ground, hot water would bubble up, sulfur water, which they actually made use of, and we'll talk about in a little bit. So these guys landed, and not only do they have to look forward to these long 8-hour missions over strenuous times to get there and back and then be shot at while they're over there, but just the living conditions were very hard, and the planes took a beating just from dust. They had a lot of troubles with spark plugs fouling, and so the mechanics and stuff like that were pretty wonderful on Iwo Jima to keep these flying planes the way they did. April 7th, 1945 was the first VLR mission. And of course, it was quite a surprise for the Japanese fighter planes to go up to meet the B-29s and see they're escorted by P-51s, which they knew was quite a fighter aircraft. And really, at that time, was the Zeros and the Franks were not really a good match against the P-51. And the Zero, for instance, didn't really have a lot of armament and didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. So if you squirted a few shots into a Zero, it usually would light up pretty good. And so they were not hard to shoot down by this time of the war. And so the first missions over there, we had aces all of a sudden. They were shooting. One guy talks about being in a B-29 and the sky rained parachutes of Japanese pilots. They really took it to them, but there were still lots of losses, and we'll talk about that. They got to, a lot of the planes that got to Iwo Jima, because of the great distance even getting there, even from like Tinian and Guam, they split up the units into the ground echelon and the air echelon. And some went by troop carrier, which is one here, Clinton Bay, which here are some of the 462nd fighter planes on the deck as they gathered them, and then they took them to Tinian, or Guam, Tinian area, anyway, that area, and then they barged them off, got them ready for flight, and then these guys spent about a month there tooling around, doing some exercises and keeping in shape flying-wise, and then they eventually flew over to Iwo Jima. In the meantime, there also went by ship. Here's the Bowman scheme, I believe, as you pronounce it. It was a Dutch hospital ship, and half of the fighter squadron was on board this ship, and they went to Hawaii, to Inuiatak, and eventually to Iwo Jima, where they actually stayed offshore for about a week while the airfield was being finished. And that was the North Field that Ed talked about, was their designated airfield for the 506. And they would use until the end of the war. So we basically have them arriving. Now, understand that these guys weren't just asked to go fly 8-hour missions. They had training and they were picked. And one of those men, Captain John Benbow of the 457th, was very typical of the type of pilot that was picked for the 506 fighter group, including my dad for one. He joined the Air Force early after the war started. He earned his wings. He began ferrying planes back and forth from Florida to like Seattle. Seattle was a demarcation point for a lot of planes that we sold to, or either sold or gave to Russia. So he ferried planes. So he'd fly a P-40, he'd fly P-39s, he'd flew bombers, whatever needed to be flown across country, my dad was involved with. And then eventually became an instructor and teach other upcoming pilots how to fly. And so he had a lot of hours in the plane. Captain Benbow, for instance, also, who was lost over Japan, and nobody really there's a famous Japanese fighter pilot that says that he shot him down over Japan, but his wingman never saw him. But basically, we feel that Captain Benbow went into a dive after some air material got in the air. If they shot down a plane, and figured he struck that material in the air and probably brought him down. So, but he was experienced. He had a lot of flying hours, well respected, and so this was the type of people that they were bringing into the group. First mission was May 28th to Japan. First fatality was Captain Miller and also Ed's bunkmate. So Ed can talk about, you know, losing people personally. And then the very next mission, which was a few days later, which is the June 1st called the Black Friday mission, which I'm going to have Ed come up and talk about. June 1st was a bomber escort mission, 140 P-51 planes in the air, rally point just off of Japan, picking up the B-29s and going in. On their way there, they get into one of these big cumulus cloud fronts, high as you can see, and they have weather ships out front, B-29s, that are supposed to say that, you know, we're probably not going to be able to penetrate this. Let's return to base. At the time, there was a lot of push to get through and get these bombing missions continuing, and they went into that cloud front and all hell broke loose. And we lost 27 Mustangs, went down, 24 pilots were lost to weather. One of the worst air disasters of the war, if not the Pacific War for sure, in one day of fighter aircraft. So with that, I'm going to have Ed, would you come up and speak and tell us about that? Ed flew June 1st. He was one of the lucky ones that made it out before things got too bad. But what happened is, once they got into that front, the skies went black, hail, thunder, turbulence. Their instruments became useless. They couldn't see past their wing, let alone see the person to the left, right, and back and front. They were running into each other, chewing off tails, maydays being called out. Everybody's on the airwaves at the same time. It's a complete panic. And here's that story. Ed Linfante, ladies and gentlemen.